David, thanks so much for being with us today at Amazon's Career Day. We're really honored to have you.
Pleasure's mine. Thanks so much for having me.
I wanted to tell you I really enjoyed reading your book, Range, which is what we are going to talk about mostly today, in addition to some kind of tips and things to keep in mind for folks looking for jobs or looking to make a change in their career. But it's really stressful to make a change in your career or to get into something new or really to try anything different. And I just took a lot of comfort in this book to know we don't have to figure it all out. So kind of just to start, would you mind giving us an overview on what you want folks to get out of your book and kind of what was the impetus to write about this topic?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think sort of the overview is that we overemphasize the idea that we should know exactly what we want to do and get started on that as early as possible, and then become increasingly narrow throughout our careers. Now, that is a model that in the past worked, but kind of in the information and creativity age, now there's actually this mountain of research, everything from artists to technological innovators, that shows that it's actually people who sort of broaden themselves over their careers, who are able to make connections between domains and pivot when something's not working, who end up actually having an advantage in this rapidly changing work world. And I think that goes counter to a lot of our intuition, where people think they really have to become more and more narrow, and that's kind of how our momentum will take us naturally. And we often overlook the advantages that come to diversifying our skill sets and our experiences, or what I call range, basically, in the book.
I do think your career and your path to writing this book would be interesting for people to hear, because you've done many different things.
Yeah, so I've almost gotten linearly less knowing exactly what I'm going to be doing since I was basically a teenager. So I was training to be a scientist in my past life, and then I wanted to merge my interest in sports and science and do something useful. And I was realizing from working as a scientist, I very quickly started asking myself, am I the type of person who wants to spend my whole life learning one or two things new to the world that are very narrow, or much shorter spans of time learning things new to me, synthesizing different things and sharing them with other people? And I was definitely the latter. And there are way more opportunities as the latter. And so I started I finished my master's degree in science and started plotting my way into journalism, taking kind of any job I could get, right? And so I bounced from one job to another, trying to round out my skills, and eventually landed at Sports Illustrated as a temp fact checker, right? But once there, realized that these science skills I had that were totally average among other scientists made me like a Nobel Prize winner at a sports magazine. Yeah, I'm obviously exaggerating, but it was something that was average in one place. Taking that somewhere where suddenly it was seen as unique is basically what I've continued to do throughout my career. That has, so I became this senior writer. I went from being a temp fact checker to the youngest senior writer at Sports Illustrated because of my oddness, because I had something that, even though not unusual in the scheme of the world, was very unusual where I was. And so I started to realize that taking something that's normal in one area and bringing it somewhere where it's seen as invention is this kind of really powerful career strategy.
Yeah, I think you're totally right that is conditioned. And even I think about, when thinking about where to go to college or, what that first job is, you kind of think of it as like, okay, when I pick my major, that's it. That's what I'm going to have to do, or I have to have that figured out. Or when I get that first job, that has to lead to my dream career. And it's just that's really not how it is for most people, right?
Not at all. Not at all. In fact, there was LinkedIn did an analysis not long ago that looked at 500,000 members and found that the strongest predictor of who would go on to become an executive was the number of different job functions that someone had worked across, right? So getting kind of a whole view of the pipeline instead of staying just in one thing. And all this research is really contrary to our intuition. So even, you mentioned knowing what you want to major in college before, there is a large body of research showing that there's this trade-off between knowing what you should be studying first and so-called sampling, right? So to give an example of this, there's an economist who found an interesting natural experiment in the higher ed systems of England and Scotland. In the period he studied, they were basically identical, except in England, students had to pick an area of focus in their mid-teen years because they had to test into a certain program. In Scotland, they could keep sampling all the way through university if they wanted. They didn't have to focus. And his question was, who wins the trade-off? It turned out that the earlier specializers, they are hired more quickly out of training. They do jump out to an income lead. They have more domain-specific skills. The later specializers get to try more different things. They learn about their own interests and abilities, and they end up, when they do pick, they have higher what economists call match quality. It's the degree of fit between their interests and abilities and the work that they do, which turns out to be extremely important for your performance. And so their growth rates are faster. And so by 6 years out, they fly past the early specializers. So the late specializers, they take a little more development time, but in the long run, they end up winning. And there's this tremendous body of research showing that if you broaden skills, sort of especially early and early mid-career, but I think always, that you not only end up with better match quality, which is hugely important for personal and professional fulfillment, and you end up more adaptable. So these people who have sort of broader base earlier in their career also end up more resilient to shocks to their industries. And so this long-term, short-term developmental trade-off, I think, is not something that's intuitive for us because we're so geared toward head starts, but really is something that shows up in human development.
In the book, too, you talk about kind of a lot of this fitting into what a wicked world. That's the term you use. Can you explain a little bit kind of this wicked world concept and how maybe you recommend people prepare to be more resilient or durable in a complicated world and when it's tough to job search?
Yeah, and I think to start out just to specify, wicked is not like a moral or philosophical judgment.
Exactly.
But it's a term created by the psychologist Robin Hogarth. And he was describing this spectrum of work and learning domains. And on one end, there was the kind, which is like work where rules are clear, next steps and goals are clear, patterns repeat. Right. On the other end of the spectrum, it's the wicked domain, where patterns don't just repeat. Like you may have to change goals. They're not just fixed. Patterns, may change. Rules may change. Feedback could be delayed. Work next year won't look like work last year. And what the research shows is that for that kind of domain where things are changing, you have to do what psychologists call transfer. That means taking your skills and knowledge and applying them to problems that you have never quite seen before, as opposed to being able to do the same thing over and over and over again. And in that situation, when you have to transfer, what predicts your ability to do that is the breadth of your skill set and the kind of problems you faced in the past. In fact, there's a classical finding in psychology that's summarized as breadth of training predicts breadth of transfer. So the broader set of problems and skills you've been forced to engage with in your training, the more that forces you to build these kind of generalized capacities that you can then apply when you're facing new problems. And so the faster the work world is changing, the greater the advantages to these people who have this broad experiences, lots of different problems they've faced, and sort of a broader toolbox.
For people who are watching this who are maybe just starting out their career journey, who are kind of in the back of their head thinking they want to make a change soon, they want to change industries, or even just maybe move to a different type of job to accomplish that, kind of what are some steps people can take just to start? I know you don't have the answer to every single person's goals, but what are some little things people can kind of do to think about that and make sure they are more resilient?
Yeah, I think there's certain habits of mind kind of that everyone should adopt.
Okay.
For one, realizing that most leaps are not flying changes. So there's a professor at the London Business School named Herminia Ibarra who studies successful career transitions. And one of the main things she finds is that there's this whole industry saying like, take this quiz and we'll just tell you exactly what you should go out and do. And in fact, that's pretty much contrary to this huge body of research in psychology that says, in fact, you need to act and then think. You need to do things, find ways to engage in something new, and then reflect on how that fits you. And that's how you learn sort of what you're good at. And so the approach you want to take is try to set up little experiments, right? You don't have to set up a flying leap. You're not Clark Kent going into the phone booth and emerging as Superman, right? Work is part of identity, and that changes in small ways. So I think if you can set up, whether that's talking to someone in a different field, whether that's having some experience volunteering or doing some part-time work, getting a keyhole view into this other type of work so that you can set up lots of little experiments. A research project that I think kind of resonates with this, that I love, was one at Harvard called the Dark Horse Project. And this was about how people find good match quality, again, that fit with their interests and abilities for their work. And the reason it was called the Dark Horse Project is because the large majority of people who were being studied, not all of them, but the large majority, would go into the researchers and say, well, don't tell people to do what I did, because I did this one thing and this other thing and that didn't fit, and I sort of like came in through the back door. And that turned out to be the norm. And the habit of mind that those people had was they would say, here's who I am right now, here are the opportunities in front of me, I'm gonna try this one, and maybe a year from now I'll change because I will have learned something about myself. And they continue that process of triangulating to get to a space where they can best succeed throughout their career. It's not something that you do and then you're done, because like the work world changes under you, and you also change. So I think setting up these small experiments and realizing that you should pivot based on what you learned is an important approach.
I think I'm really glad you said that. The work world changes, of course, and some of those things we can't control. But I like that you said, too, you also change.
Yeah.
Like sometimes I think we forget that just because you wanted to do something and when you were 22, like it is okay when you're 50 that you're like, I don't like that anymore, or I wanted something different. And that's really normal.
That's a really important point.
Kind of what advice do you have folks who are maybe a little further on in their career, maybe didn't expect to change careers or jobs again, or who, because of COVID, because of what have you, are kind of thinking now, I do want to make this pivot later in my career. How do I market myself? How do I talk about the things I've done for the past 30 years and make that an asset, even if it's really different?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I think there's sort of the tactical and kind of the psychological. And the psychological is like, don't take it personally, right? And sometimes, I think for a certain generation, lateral mobility is kind of a dirty word, but it shouldn't be, because, you may make a move that doesn't feel like you're going forward, but if you're getting a better sense of your interests and abilities and adding to your toolkit, that's okay. Remember, short and long-term development can sometimes be in some conflict. So first of all, I think is just not taking it personally. But then I think thinking about, going through this process of reflection, there's something called self-regulatory learnings. People who continually get off of so-called performance plateaus, like they keep getting better and better, tend to be good self-regulatory learners. So you should have a system for reflection where you go back through your experiences. So when I was doing this work, maybe I wasn't a formal leader, but what did I learn about leadership in that position? What did I learn about collaboration? What did I learn that I wasn't as good at as I hoped to be? Because there always are those things, right? That might not be nice to learn, but it's important. And so I think when it comes to marketing yourself, is building your career, whatever material you're presenting, as a narrative, as a story, as a series of pivots based on things you learned about yourself and the work world. You may also have to go through some algorithmic selection, right? Where you don't get as much chance to explain your narrative. And so you also just want to know, what are the keywords you need to highlight? Like, you need to go mine those past experiences to know when you can use things like leadership, collaborative, interdisciplinary, whatever it is. And I think as you go through that process of mining those past experiences, that will also help you realize some of those keywords that you really are entitled to, even if they weren't formally in your position.
In the book, too, you also mentioned compare yourself to yourself yesterday, not to younger people who aren't you. And I thought also that was a good reminder, and maybe what some of these people were feeling, too, if you're just paying attention to an age. Those people didn't have the experience that they had, and that's okay, too.
The age thing is important because we tend to view talent as like this stable thing that, one person and another are separated by a certain amount, and that's a stable trajectory forever. And so someone who's behind will never catch up. And that just turns out not to be the case in human development. People progress at different rates in essentially everything. And so you really don't know until you start trying things, how good you can get at something and what your developmental pace is going to look like. And so when we're sitting around saying, here's someone who's younger than me who has more than me, it's ignoring one of the most consistent findings in all of the science of talent development, which is that development is not linear. It proceeds in these kinds of zigs and zags. And so you kind of need to keep that in mind, and comparing yourself to someone else is just it's really not going to tell you much.
And I also want to say, too, for people watching who maybe are like, all right, now I have to do all of this and start doing pivots and make my 10-year plan or whatever. You don't have to do all this right now. This isn't need to all be happening all the time. There's a lot going on right now. Like, hopefully you can take some of this and incorporate maybe in the next change you make, or the next time you're thinking about a career, or for a loved one who's thinking about it and you're trying to figure out how to help them. So it's not meant to be overwhelming, but I think it's good advice and reminds us we're all kind of thinking about some of these things.
Try one thing.
Right.
Exactly. If you're doing 0 things, try one thing. 2 tips to give people. I asked this woman in the Netherlands, a scientist named Mariah Elfrink-Gemser, who ran these incredible studies that followed people in all sorts of different domains. It started with like soccer players, some age 12, who went on to be pros, but also looked at people in the classroom and these things. And the ones who continually improved, got off performance plateaus. I said, what's the most important word, Mariah? If you give one word, she said, reflection. People think they do it, but they do not. So what she told me to do was, she gave me like 5 different questions. It was like, what do I want to do? What skills do I think I need to do it? Am I sure I want to do it? Why do I want to do it? Who do I need to get to help me? Who do I need to enlist to help me, to allow me to do it? And she said, answer these every month. And I said, that's crazy. I'm going to answer these the same every month. Never answered them the same way twice. Never did. And so you may think you reflect enough, but we don't learn as much about ourselves as we can if you don't have a formal system of reflection. Find a way to do it. And I think it's especially important right now. So I was just reading through the work of a Penn psychologist named Katie Milkman, and she has this fascinating work looking at how seemingly arbitrary boundaries in life turn out to be really important like moments for catapulting change. So everyone says like New Year's resolutions always fail. New Year's resolutions are actually, most of them do fail, but compared to resolutions for behavior change generally, they're phenomenally successful. In fact, resolutions made at the beginning of a year, at the beginning of a week, after your birthday, these arbitrary points that have a sense of turning a chapter in your life turn out to be a huge boost for behavioral change. And I think re-emerging from a pandemic is a really important time, a really important chapter that's turning, and a time to say, what person do I want to emerge as and what behaviors do I want that person to have that maybe are better than what I had before? So I'm doing a lot of that personal reflection right now because the science says right now will actually be a time where you'll probably be more successful with behavior changes that you want because of this shift that's going on in society. So take advantage of it.
Thank you, David. This was super helpful, really interesting. Thank you for being with us for Amazon's Career Day. Hopefully for our viewers, this was helpful. And to your point, if you were not doing anything, maybe try one of these tips and see how it feels. So thank you so much.
Totally my pleasure. Thank you for having me.